Hello, everyone. It's nice to see your familiar faces. I think we're all friends here. So I think I've shared with some of you who've been here, I guess most of you have been here, that we're going to try to get started a little more promptly, not have too much time with warm-up chatter. Only because some of you are squeezing this in during your day, during other things, you make commitments. It's probably never wise to book something immediately on the heels of a spiritual community type thing. These things do go long, but we'll do our best today, both to start soon and to finish pretty darn close to the time promised. But I wonder if anybody would like to share. Let's see, what could we have the chat feature. So first of all, if anyone wants to unmute and just say hi to the group, we've got a little time. You can unmute and say hi. And if anyone would like to put in the chat, how about this? In the chat, if you want to make a note about what you've been exploring these days spiritually. So if there's a book you've been reading, an author you've been turned on to, a topic or theme, that might be really interesting for us to all share. Doesn't need to be a lot of detail, but in the meeting chat, that's down the bottom there, looks like a little bubble, cartoon bubble, in case you haven't used that before. And otherwise, we will start in just a minute. Hello, Mimi. It's hard to greet everyone by name because then sometimes I miss people as they come in, but I will say hi, Deborah, again. And Joni, our poetry manager, director of poems. I don't know, we got to come up with a funny name for that. And Zarko, of course. Dear Barbara, hello. Catherine, Lanny, there's Anna coming in the room. And of course, I see some of you are not on camera, but listening. Hello to all of you listening while you do whatever you're doing, working, doing the dishes, driving, who knows. All right, let's look at what's going on in the chat, and then we're gonna, oh, there we go. So we have service. That's a wonderful focus. Slowing down. So simple, but so powerful. Joni is reading Rooted by Lyanda Haupt. And I don't know how to pronounce her name, but I got to interview her, which is why Joni's reading her for my podcast. So if you don't know, I have a podcast, and you just look up Jonathan Ellerby wherever you find podcasts. And it's a, what, did you like the interview, Joni? Yeah. I mean, obviously you liked it enough to look up her work. You know, sometimes people's works and their interviews don't always match, but it's a really beautiful book. I would like to say, if any of you have any interest in the natural world or finding spirituality in kind of really the magic of the ordinary life without that sounding too cliche, it's really a beautiful book. I have to say, it's not often, and this, I don't mean to be this, I mean for this to be a backwards compliment to myself, but it's not often that I read a book and I just think, damn, I wish I wrote that book. But Joni is nodding. This is really, I think, one of those books because it's so, yeah, it's just so beautifully, it's not just beautifully written, but it's constructed well and with a lot of, I'd say, creativity. So it feels like it's got everything you want in a beautiful spiritual book with a huge sense of the poetic. And yet it's just different enough that you kind of feel like, ooh, this is different. So there you go. Oh, and Nazila, inspired towards poetry. That's great. All right. Well, how about okay, well, how about this? Let's get into this, because if we're a small group today, it's kind of cool because then we can take advantage of it and we can maybe all have a bit of a voice. And I I like that. So let's take before we take our breath, I'd like to say a couple things about our theme. And then we will breathe together, and then we will listen together. So poetry. Poetry, poetry, poetry. If you are not a member, well, let me say that differently. If you're a member of the Old Soul Republic newsletter, then you saw the newsletter go out this week, and the theme was poetry. So there's a video message, there's written text, and as I've shared before, it often coincides with or complements what we're talking about here in this session with Humanity's team. It's not always 100% connected. If you don't know what it is, you can look up my website and you'll find a link to the Old Soul Republic. And it's just a content-driven weekly newsletter. But I wanted to do a quick kind of almost like an intro to the topic and then go deeper in a little bit. But I thought poetry would be a very important and interesting topic for us to discuss, because poetry is one of those things that socially has been relegated to a pretty narrow field of interest. I would argue that particularly in the Western world today, it's kind of like there's articles and there's literature and there's people who, quote, like to read, and they may move between fiction and nonfiction. But many of us have been conditioned to kind of separate poetry completely. And it's this sort of isolated category. I remember in high school, poetry had this sort of distinctness, this uniqueness that set it apart. And yet I don't think in a way that helped it to be integrated in my life. Now, I loved poetry in high school, but I think that a lot of us grow up sort of feeling like poetry is for some people and not others. And only certain kinds of people can write poetry or should write poetry, and other people don't. I personally believe or feel, experience, that poetry is innate. That's an interesting starting point. I believe poetry, just like music, like the spoken word, like prose writing, like the body itself, movement, I think poetry is a natural human language. In fact, I would argue, to stimulate some thinking here, poetry might be more natural to us as a language than, certainly than academic writing, and probably more so than what's come to be conventional fiction and nonfiction. Now, I'm a book junkie my whole life. I mean, I'm telling you, God forbid if I lost my ability to read, I'd probably still buy books just to feel them and smell them and have them around. So I love everything about a book, and I'm not diminishing that. But if we think of poetry broadly, so that we can include rhyming poetry, we can include structured poetry, we can include, think Emily Bronte, think William Shakespeare. We can have deconstructed postmodern poetry, which is kind of like the E.E. Cummings, the words fall down the page and don't have a sensible order. And I would argue a lot of spoken word today, which is sort of on the edge of the field of rap music and hip hop, which you may not relate to as poetry, but of course it is. It literally came out of spoken word poetry. Now, as with any of these styles of poetry, we may not like the content, we may not like the presentation, and I don't think every type of poetry is for everyone. But when I say that poetry is innate, I think what I mean to suggest is that human communication is innately more holistic than it is linear. And that to me is sort of the magic of poetry. Poetry is typically written in what I would call a liminal form. Liminal meaning between worlds. So it's written so that it crosses between literalism and imagery, metaphor and fact, deep emotion and discursive or structured thought. Um, and that's, I think that's important. I think it is important not only to engage poetry better by understanding its nature, but I think to see it as an innate language of life tells us something about life, that we as humans are more like that, right? We're more messy, right? I mean, when I do a tremendous amount of business consulting. That's my kind of primary work for income. And the vast majority of breakdown I see amongst leaders is emotional. And it's poetic in the sense that they, like a living poem, are not as evidence-based as they'd like to appear, as rational as they'd like to appear, as structured as they think they are. People are like poems. We are sometimes structured and sometimes free-flowing. We sometimes follow convention and sometimes don't. We are as emotional as we are anything else, and we are deeply creative, deeply imaginative. And so much of what transfers or transpires between us is profoundly evocative, resonant, meaning not literal. So much of what happens between us when we communicate is really beyond any what I would call structured word, which means that we could try to articulate it in a written description. But very often, for many of us, when we find the right poem, it brings us closer to a lived experience. And I think the evidence of this power or potency lies in the fact that poetry, I would argue, more often than fiction and nonfiction, can more immediately transport us into our own liminal state, where we become aware of the spiritual world or the spiritual self, or even the fullness of the emotional self. Now, I'm not suggesting that reading A Course in Miracles can't change your life. Of course it can. I'm not suggesting that reading Eckhart Tolle's The Power of Now can't change your life. Of course it can. But I am saying that it's a lot more work to get into those things. It can take time to get into those things. And very often we get to the end of highly recommended spiritual books and we kind of scratch our head and say, I wonder why that was recommended. Or we'll say, yeah, well, I think I was just reminded of what I already know. You know, we say that about too many things. Poetry has this immediacy. And the irony about poetry, and I'm going to kind of wrap up my thoughts in a moment, and then maybe we'll do a brief check-in with the group. Then we're going to get into reading some poetry as our meditation for today, and then have some conversation pretty soon. So I wanted to say that another profound quality of poetry that I think absolutely sets it apart from other writing, and I think this is a pretty nuanced opinion, which means, I don't know, may not mean a lot to you, but I hope that if you think about it a little bit, or feel about it a little bit, you'll see just what I mean, and then suddenly something magical will be revealed to you. I spoke about this briefly in the video that was with the Old Soul Republic. Poetry reveals the spiritual power of authenticity. So I'm just going to take a few minutes, to talk about authenticity and why this is so significant, so magical, because I believe there is a gift for each of us in our daily lives that poetry embodies. The power of authenticity as it relates to poetry is, first, that poetry is arguably always at its best when there's a feeling of authenticity to it. In other words, you feel the energy, the spirit of the writer, right? It's a very, almost like a naked art form. People have used that imagery, that it's a very exposing art form because you're stripping away, platitudes and padding, and it's just, good poetry is just what it needs to be and nothing more. Really, I think it's one of the definitions of a great poem. It's not, you can fill a book with 7 great ideas and write around them for thousands of pages, right? In fact, we all have probably read a book by one of our favorite authors that was just like another book they wrote, except they just told different stories and they kind of ordered it differently. That happens a lot too. But a poem demands a level of authenticity from the author that we know. And we've heard this in classes probably, and you've seen this even in movies. A powerful poem is like the heart exposed, the soul exposed. But here's the magic of that. And this is something I hope we can understand in the broader story of life. What feels so vulnerable in writing poetry from that place is that when we look at the poem, we see nothing but ourselves. I mean, it may be about the universe, but it's something so personal, so intimate, and we've laid it bare on a page. The irony, which is what I call the magic, is that is almost never the way a poem is written or is read, pardon me. Now, of course, nothing is 100%. But when someone's poem is purely authentic, is a deep, unfiltered personal sharing, I would say very paradoxically, when we read it, what we experience almost always first is not them at all. We experience ourselves. Isn't it? Now just think about that. On the author's side, it feels as vulnerable as it can be because they're afraid of being seen so deeply. And if it's published, maybe by lots of people who won't care. But in powerful poetry, the first thing we encounter as we read it is ourselves, or whatever that poem is opening us towards, right? So we don't say, well, most of us don't say, this poem is written by an angry person. When you feel a poem that is truly written without filter, the first time you read it, you feel anger. You feel angriness. Or if they're depicting spirit, as you read it, most of us are not thinking, wow, this person's pretty spiritual. No, when you enter in a poem, because of the brevity and the immediacy, you have your own experience of spirit. And then we can step back later and say, oh, well, how angry is that person? Or how spiritual is that person? But the reason why that's an important metaphor for life is that I believe that many people, we walk around and we fear being unfiltered in our lives, in our choices, in our dress, in our speech, because it would be too revealing, too personal. Most of us live with a greater reflection of conditioning than probably we'd like to admit. And yet, isn't it ironic that when we are most authentic, not only in poetry, but in life, what we're really doing is helping people connect with themselves, not us. There's something about the nature of the soul, its energy, that when what you share, say, or do comes from that place, it resonates with the same place inside. You get that? So when we can be profoundly present with someone, not as a intellectual responsibility, but as a deeply felt place, they can feel that in themselves. And I would argue that many of the world's most famous performers and personalities are often unfiltered people who, as a dancer, as an athlete, I hate to say it, even as a politician, who have found a way to express something of their nature so directly that people are compelled by it. Sometimes not even paying attention to the content, right? Music lovers will often say, well, I like this genre or that genre, this type or that type, but really any good music I'll check out, right? There's this sense that when something comes from a deeper authenticity, it transcends. And my last analogy, and then I'm going to wrap up. You know, my son is, it's funny because he's 14. I would argue, we're profoundly connected and profoundly similar in some very, very deep ways. But in terms of our exterior expression and interests, we're super different. So he's really into sports. He's really into football. This kid knows everything about American football, who does what, who did what, when, how many years ago, points. I don't know. I just learned like last week that nobody scores a basket in football, and there's no such thing. Like no one's there's no home run, right? Like I barely understand any of this. But out of my love for him, I've been to a football game, of course, and we went to like an NFL game. And of course, in that experience, if being open-minded, of course, I was inspired because it doesn't matter whether I like football or not. I'm seeing athletes at the absolute top of their capacity. Now, I'm still not going to watch a lot of it, but to be there in person, to see the physicality, to see the athleticism, and many of you experience that as well. Ballet is a great example. I'll be honest, no intellectual person wants to admit to not loving ballet. I don't love ballet. Can I watch it? And have I been? Of course, because an extraordinary ballet is breathtaking for me, whether I really like ballet or not. And the same could be said of whatever, country music or 100 other things. So my conclusion is only to say that poetry is such a rich and complex phenomena that if we bring attention to it, we can unravel more and more layers of what it is, what it can connect us with, how it is a vehicle of connection for us, and how it can be our own vehicle of expression, to write poetry, to attempt to write poetry, and to explore the diversity of poetic styles and poetic voices is an opportunity to connect with the world more fully. And it doesn't mean we have to love it all in the end. And it doesn't mean we have to say it's all great when we don't feel that's true. But the point is to explore the immediacy of poetry and the way it can bring us into a deeper relationship, not only with the world around us, which authors like Mary Oliver do so well, takes the physical world and turns it to sparkling light, but I would say it does a far better job than many mediums, possibly any medium, in taking us into the realms of the divine and the sublime. So with that, I'm going to stop there. And I have a few readings picked out for you that I would like to share before we go into some conversation. But I'm going to ask Garth if he's there to bring us back to the gallery view. And I wonder if anyone would like to make a brief comment or observation or have a reaction to what I've been sharing. You know, for the sake of time, I'm sorry, I get to be the one that rambles, and I'm going to ask you to be brief. But was anyone there that would like to comment, either reacting to something I've said, adding a layer of something, saying something about what poetry's been in your life, bringing another perspective to it? So brief but welcome. Why don't we have a few voices? So just go ahead and unmute yourself and jump in. Mercedes, did I see your finger?
Yeah. Yeah, I will say that I discovered poetry as a structure of expression when I was a teenager. But I always said when I was a kid that living was a poetic act. I don't know why I said it, but I always said it. And now I understand that what I was trying to say is that if we could see the inner landscapes, we would understand without doubt why living is a poetic act. And that's the way I have always kind of, explore life, my teaching, and everything I do in life. I did dabble in poetry, and now I find it a beautiful way of expressing myself. But when you were talking about poetry and the sublime and the way it makes us be naked, I thought about classical music and my first experience with it. So my first experience with it was I completely felt naked in front of somebody. And I couldn't understand what that somebody knew me better than myself. And there was no doubt about it. And what I could see was this kind of line. It's like I could not only see that he knew it was a male composer, but that everybody that he had touched in any way knew also.
Yeah.
So in that moment, I felt I was given a torch, and my purpose was to pass that torch, whatever that means. So it was also a poetic act. And what I feel that poetry does, be it through music, be it through words, be it through living, is that it mirrors, it reflects what the soul knows.
Mm-hmm.
So it reflects out ourselves, and it reflects what we share. So that's my experience with poetry.
Thank you. I was making notes over here on the side. So if you see me looking away, I don't want to make a long commentary because you said so many beautiful things. It is my nature to try to highlight some things. And some of it is not what you said, but what I took, right? What came to me. And in no particular order, I just wanted to bring to the attention of the group. I like the way what you said reminded me how important it is that writing poetry can just be for ourselves. That it's really not about did you publish it and did you share it, but the act of writing poetry is a process that can heal, that can clarify, that can be cathartic, a variety of things. The other thing that came to mind, again, I'm just kind of briefly going through some things that you reminded me about, or reminded me to comment on, is the way poetry illustrates how even the most difficult things in life can be beautiful. Not good, not desirable, and not even condonable. But we probably, if you think about it, we've probably all read a poem about political injustice or torture or poverty or loss, betrayal. And what's remarkable about poetry is it demonstrates, right? I feel like this was a part of what you were saying, that there's something universal in these experiences, and when they're portrayed in a pure or less filtered way, there's a kind of sublime or beautiful quality. And interestingly, when you take something from the material, you express its inner experience and it becomes sublime. The next step is wordless, right? You know, so you hear that piece of music, you see that piece of art, you read that poetry, and there's just knowing. There's just knowing. And that's where I'll stop, is I think that deep knowing affirms something, awakens something in us. So thank you. That was wonderful. Someone else, a few brief words. Mimi, please unmute yourself and come on in.
So I edited and wrote in an anthology 25 years ago.
Wow.
And it was just a small kind of private thing that a select number of people knew about. And as a matter of fact, Tricia Dubois has a poem in here or two. Yeah, Tricia. Anyway, I was looking at the introduction. Last night, I hardly got any sleep because I was pouring through all this old poetry, seeing if there was anything to submit. And everything I looked at needed to be revised, which is interesting because I'm looking at it with different eyes now.
Yeah.
And different heart too. But I wrote, just very briefly, why this anthology? Writing and reading poetry virtually feeds my soul. It heals, it reveals, it revivifies, it animates, it gives a voice to silent beauty, reverence, and awe. It alchemizes the prima materia. Poets are, I can never say this word, but I love it, chiaroscurists, artists working in light and dark. They illuminate the dark places and cast shadows on the light, and poetry is one of our richest inner resources.
Beautiful. And did you have a poem that you picked from that anthology that you thought you might want to read today?
I didn't get that far. I have to look at them real quickly, but
Okay.
go ahead. And
Yeah.
I'll think, I'll see if there's anything.
That was beautiful. I don't mind putting you on the spot if you find something.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. That's great. Go ahead, Tricia.
I have signed up for your newsletter, but I never get it. So I didn't know the topic. I don't know why I'm not getting it. But anyway,
do you check your junk folder?
Yeah. I had the same problem with Althea. I never got stuff, so I just need to change the email address. Anyway.
Cosmically protected.
Yeah, right. For many years I wrote poetry and was involved with well, actually at one point I was involved with my poetry group where we created a quarterly poetry journal where we accepted submissions for. And we ended up doing poetry art events, whatever that means, where we would get together, we'd have the art, the poets would write poems in response to the art, and then we would have a reading for it. And I did that for many years, and I did it several times, mostly in Taos, New Mexico. But it's been 10 years since I've written any poetry. Since I had this is the 10th year. This is the 10-year anniversary of my cancer. I had cancer and I've cancer free for 10 years. And so when that happened in 2013, my whole life shifted for various reasons. And so I had never gone back to writing. I didn't have the space, mental space, or or the time, or not the time, anyway, I just couldn't get to it. So I haven't written any. So hearing all the conversation about it is quite poignant for me. And, you know, it was a very important part of my life. And I felt like I could say that I was a poet, but I haven't felt like that for a long time. So, but I would like to share a poem.
Do you have one?
I do. I just need to go get it. Give me 1 second.
Great.
What were you going to say?
Well, so is it far?
No, it's just right here. I just have to get the book.
Okay,
Hang on.
grab it, and then I'm going to make a couple of comments. So first of all, I think that we're a small enough group, but particularly on camera. Maybe we're not going to do a breakout. Let's stay together and chat. I think that could be good. And certainly if anyone's listening off camera, you're welcome to whatever, pop back on camera or put your hand up or something. But after Trisha reads her poem, you know, I do have a question. I'm interested in exploring what it's been like for some of you, because I know, well, I think I now know all of you at least enough by feeling and by your interests. And it is an interesting question. What stops us from writing poetry? When do we write poetry? Right? Some of us, like prayer, we write poetry when we're in need, but not when everything's going well. And others, it's quite the opposite. We write poetry when everything's beautiful and we're in love with life. And then when we're really struggling, the pen dries up. So think about that a little bit. And Trisha, we're going to take your poem and then we'll go to Nazila for a comment. But Trisha, please.
Well, I was just going to say, one of my experiences of writing poetry, when I had an event to write for, so I was going to be reading in front of a small audience with the art there, and it was always really cool, is that I really had worked on it. It wasn't just waiting for inspiration. I had to find the inspiration. So that was good for me. It was really good for me. So anyway, I just went into, because when we did those, we actually printed little books with the poetry in it. So I just went and got one. And this is one that actually I did not write for one of those, and it's very short. But for about 3 years, I went and traveled in the Sahara Desert. So this is in response to that. It's called 100 Camels, Sahara Desert, Niger. There is only sun and shade here, only stone and sky and sand, and the faded indigo of our robes to satisfy the eye. It is enough. For a moment, at the edge of a wed, I rest beneath an acacia tree, drowsing with the camels in the midday heat. That's it.
Magnificent.
Thank
That's
you.
beautiful. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
So we're going to have some other poems read today. That's lovely. Nazila, you have your Homer Simpson hand up. Can you share?
Hello. Yes, hello everyone.
Is it Nazila? Am I saying it right?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
Perfect. I wanted to acknowledge your depth. It is really beautiful. As I was listening to you, I didn't want to raise my hand because I wanted to keep on listening to you, because it's as if I see your depth. So I started writing something. I see your depth. I see your light. I see your kindness. And I'm not a poet, but I was inspired. And I wrote something. Last week you shared about, I'm not familiar with your newsletter. And because I've just been overwhelmed. My brother's also having a surgery tomorrow. So if you guys can send a prayer, that would be great. I'm emotional. Okay. Are you looking for a soul doctor? I hope I can read this without crying. Does your soul sometimes cry? Does your soul sometimes cough? I hear a sneeze. Are you looking for a soul doctor? Excuse me. You've come to the right place. I spoke to the wind. I whispered to the butterflies. I sang to the hummingbirds. I wrote it on the clouds. I even wrote it on the raindrops. Do you still question me? I wrote it on the sea. You have come to the right place. Come in, come in. Sorry, I'm emotional. I don't know if it's because of my brother having surgery tomorrow, but yeah, the other thing, I'm not a poet, but you know, I'm super sensitive. I think that's my typology. So anyway, I wrote a couple of other things as I was listening to you. I am from Iran. I have no home. I just wrote this when I was listening to you. I have lost my home. Where is my home? I know it's close, close as my heart, close as my breath, close as my heartbeat, close as my skin, and close as my bones. And then I heard the poetry about camels. It reminded me of when we were in Egypt, and this man came up and asked my ex-husband. So I wrote 3 lines. He said, "How much for your wife? Would 200 camels be enough?" I said, "What?" That's just what I wrote as I was listening to everybody.
That's great. Thank
Thank
you. That's very, I'm personally very touched that our times together have brought this up for you. And I think we have been blessed in return. You know, I'm going to stop the analyzing and just thank you. You know, it's so difficult for us in the modern Western world to realize that from, I would argue, most of time, the greatest way to dignify anything is by feeling it and with silence. You know, when I've been privileged to travel to other parts of the world, particularly into indigenous parts of the world, when something like From the Soul is shared, like either of your poems, the appropriate response is just to be quiet. And it's hard though, I think, because we feel, oh, someone said something, I better validate them. I better analyze it. I better talk about why it's important. But it's sort of like, as you said, this, as I think you're all saying, this poetry is bringing us somewhere to the edge of the soul, somewhere beyond where the mind has any business. Mimi, did you find a poem that you wanted to read out of that book? And if anyone else came here today with a poem handy, if you know how to put your emoji up, put your emoji hand up, just so I know that there's a poem waiting to be read. If you don't, then after Mimi, you can just wave your hand, but it's under reactions, usually at the bottom of your screen. So it's helpful for me just for time to know how many poems we can squeeze in. Mimi, would you like to read something?
Sure. So the title of this poem is Gold Dust. And when I put this anthology together, it ended up being pretty much into like it naturally, organically fell into sections of the life cycle. And so this was written for my son's 13th birthday, my son Matthew.
So Mimi, I'm going to ask you in the group something. When you finish, if it's okay, let's just pause for a moment and just let everyone receive it. And we won't jump in and compliment you, or you don't have to apologize for anything. So, and then maybe we'll hear some other poems. So thank you.
Sounds good.
I'm grateful you're willing to share. So please.
Panning for gold, I stumbled upon you, your light mirrored in bubbles laughing, shimmering in newly fallen rain that dances with the stream. I want you to know that gold runs through your veins. So many unmined treasures to be found and refined, milled into magical dust, which falls from your broadening shoulders and cracking voice, sprinkling your gifts on all you encounter. With rusty pan, you search diligently for gold and bring me flowers, nectar enticing bees, to make honey the color of your great-grandfather's name. At times arduous, the mining expedition will challenge you to believe there lies neither one more breath in you, nor strength to move just one more inch. And yet, still, you must persist, mining the ore that is yours.
Thank you. That's beautiful. Thank you. Catherine, would you like to read your poem?
I did not write this poem.
That's fine.
Okay.
And we'll do the same for Catherine. We'll pause after.
Toward the one, the perfection of love, harmony, and beauty, the only being, united with all the illuminated souls who form the embodiment of the Master, the Spirit of Guidance.
Thank you. Thank you. Shoni, what do you have for us?
I have a poem by a poet named, I believe, Lala Dead. She was a 14th century. Let's just call her a mystic. And she writes, I searched for myself until I grew weary, but no one I know now reaches the hidden knowledge by means of effort. Then, absorbed in Thou Art This, I found the place of wine. There, all the jars are filled, but no one is left to drink.
That's good. That's beautiful. Thank you. Thank you. Garth, please. Oh, you're muted, which is sort of ironic.
It figures. So I have a good friend who writes lots of poetry. I do not write poetry, but I love to read poetry aloud. So this one is entitled, Behold the Sacred. Behold the sacred, that which is revered. Observe the protected, that to which we're endeared. The laughter of a child, the wise look of an elder, the reflection off water, the comfort of a shelter. The simplest of things that touch the heart and are felt, the wonder of existence into the all as we meld. Into a oneness, we give thanks.
Thank you. That's wonderful. Thank you.
I created a website for Gaggy, as her pen name is, at quantum, QUANTOEM.com.
Okay.
Quantum.
Beautiful. Beautiful. And certainly if any of you would like to share with me what you read here today, I would be happy if you're wanting to share it or just want me to have it, let me know. But we are going to be featuring poems in the Republic, in the Old Soul Republic newsletter. And so you can certainly send them to me, or if you get the newsletter, you'll see an email address. And Joni here will be receiving and helping curate them. So we're going to go to Mercedes next. And I just want to be sure, because I'm going to be reading a few before we close. Is there anyone else who has one that you just haven't put your hand up? Just so I know if there's someone that's getting missed. Are we good? Okay. Okay, Zarko. So Mercedes, after you, we'll invite Zarko, and then I'll bring us to a close today. This is so beautiful. I'm so grateful that we have left the world of analysis and seeming wise. Go ahead.
It calls In Awe with Walls. Walls erected in clay, wood, and stone, hay, leaves, water, and bones, soft and permeable, flowing gowns, thick and strong, ancient of unfathomable boundaries, containing, confining, protecting, high or low, our gaze will go, fluttering signs, scrapes and stains, bleeding time, trails of tales, hanging here and there, here and everywhere. Changing lines and shapes, hues defiant, uncertain, unaware, color wheels and graded palettes, and the heart beats slowly, quick, stops or skips. Invisible worlds, clues of life and death, silent witnesses in a fragile array, human, primitive, vulnerable, eternal. Written legacies and triumphs, misery and regrets, growing scores, random mistakes, nails and holes, sweet, young, and old. Thousands of stories brought up, turned down, made tall, made short, truth to be told, perjuries and cons, infinite possibilities. History, you know? Oh, walls, I am in awe.
That was awesome. Thank you. And Zarko, the last of our group poems.
Okay. I'm not going to read my own poetry, but I'm going to read a short poem which was kind of beloved of my wife used to like it as a very, very important for her life. And she put it as a motto to the book, which manuscript of the book about the Bororo Indians' funeral ceremonies. And it's a very, very short poem, just 3 verses, and it's in Italian, and I'm going to translate it as I can. And it's by Salvatore Quasimodo, and it goes, ognuno sta solo sul cuor della terra, trafitto da un raggio di sole ed è subito sera. And it's English, it would be, everybody is alone on the heart of earth, hit by a ray of sun. And then suddenly there is evening. That's it.
Wow.
Thank you.
My goodness. Well, I guess some of us are also built to appreciate poems more than others, because I just feel decimated by the beauty of all these poems. Excuse me. So to bring us to a close, I had some readings in mind, and they are, so being a poetry lover, I mean, I felt overwhelmed by choosing 3, but I wanted to illustrate something. And the first poem I want to read is actually a poem that I feel confident most of you have heard many, many times. And that's why I want to read it. I want to read a poem that's almost read too often, arguably. But I want you to hear it today and just wonder with me, why? What is the power of some poems that they grasp millions of people? They become anthems, they become cliches, they're so beloved. So I'm going to share one that I think I would imagine, I would think all of you have heard this, and it's by Mary Oliver, and it's The Journey. I'm sure some of you have heard it 1,000 times, and some of you maybe just a few. And then I want to read a poem by Rilke, Rainier Maria Rilke, the German mystic. And you know, it was originally written in German. I kind of wish I could do the justice, but I'm going to read the English. And to me, it's sort of like a stepping stone. Some of you will have heard this for sure, but more of you probably not. And I think it's just an extraordinary poem and demonstrates the power of poetry in spirituality. And then I'm going to close by sharing a poem that I wrote. So it's 3 poems, and we're just going to read. I'm just going to read them each. And you can I'm going to invite you to close your eyes and be with your breath, and then we'll just say goodbye. And the reason why I wanted to finish with my own poem was because it just felt sort of, I don't know, maybe dishonest or disingenuous to host this, to talk about this and not show up. Interestingly, it's in my book, Return to the Sacred. There's a variety of poems in there for those that you have read it. And I have to say, as just a parting reflection, because I'm not going to say much after I do the readings, except goodbye and thank you. As an author, and I have another book coming out this year, and hopefully there's another one in the works right now. It's interesting how often when I write a poem, I think this is really better than a whole book. And when I flip through Return to the Sacred, I think, I probably could have just pulled 4 poems out of that book, and that probably would have been enough. Like, no one really needs to read that damn book. It's just a lot of words. So there you go. That'll be the order of things. So I invite you to take this however you want. But this is our meditation for the day, our closing prayer. So if you like, you can close your eyes. You can sit quietly. You can be with your breath. And we'll begin with Mary Oliver, and we'll feel the progression of the way these poems take us inward. One day, you finally knew what you had to do and began. Though the voices around you kept shouting their bad advice, though the whole house began to tremble and you felt the old tug at your ankles, "Mend my life," each voice cried. But you didn't stop. You knew what you had to do. Though the wind pried with its stiff fingers at the very foundation, though their melancholy was terrible, it was already late enough and a wild night, and the road full of fallen branches and stones. But little by little, as you left their voice behind, the stars began to burn through the sheets of cloud, and there was a new voice, which you slowly recognized as your own, that kept you company as you strode deeper and deeper into the world, determined to do the only thing you could do, determined to save the only life that you could save. Center of all centers, core of cores, almond self enclosed and growing sweet, all this universe to the furthest stars and beyond them, is your flesh, your fruit. Now you feel how nothing clings to you. Your vast shell reaches into endless space, and there the rich, thick fluids rise and flow. Illuminated in your infinite peace, a billion stars go spinning through the night, blazing high above your head. But in you is the presence that will be when all the stars are dead. And finally, I see through the ancient archways. The sacred door is open. In the distance, a traveler comes through time, and from the heart of spirit. I know the journey well. I watch the moving form, though I cannot tell if they are coming or going. Is the sun rising or setting? Is it man or woman? The path shines like a thin, deep river. Shadows and light play tricks on the mind. But none of this matters. This is the arrival and the departure. There is only one direction, inward. The road is littered with scrolls and beads, talismans, scriptures, rattles, and robes. Every step is sacred, and none of it matters. For the road only leads one place, home. And with that, I thank you all for being here today. Much love and gratitude for all that you've shared, for those who listened deeply, for those who spoke deeply, for those who read deeply. And maybe we'll see you next week. So thank you. All right. Lots of love and poetry. Bye-bye.
Thank you.